Welcome to the Utah Epodcopalians. Now, this is a podcast about our unusual church in our unusual land, the Diocese of Utah, and the area that pretty much encompasses the state of Utah. Now, today, we have something really, I think, when we talk about the unique church, that truly separates us, and that is every 3 years, the church meets to discuss not only budget and administrative affairs, but gets into theology, gets into the types of rituals that protect and define the Episcopal Church. And it's done with the bishops of the church, it's done with the clergy of the church, and the laity of the church. Now, when I say every 3 years, this time it went 4 years because of the pandemic. And normally it lasts about 10 days, and this one lasted 5 days because of the pandemic. Now, to talk about that, we have one of the elected representatives, we call them deputies, to General Convention, the Reverend Kurt Wiesner of the great St. Paul's Church here in Salt Lake City, one of the really, really beautiful churches. So if you haven't been there, you got to go to that one. It's just one of the truly magnificent Episcopal churches in our diocese. We have 22 congregations, but this is one, it's a must-see in Salt Lake City. So welcome, sir, and we appreciate you coming here because you were there. You were in Baltimore earlier this month when we talked about some of these great discussions, and some of them are really church changing, aren't they? Such as, let's talk about the Book of Common Prayer, which has been for 400 years or something in the Anglican Church. And this year, there was kind of a change. There was a different evolution of that handles many of the contemporary issues that we're facing today. Let's start there, and then we're going to move into some other topics. First of all, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Thanks, Craig. This convention was shaped by COVID. And I think that really, everything that happened there was in that framework. And so the reality is that, of course, it took 4 years for us to gather together. It was postponed for an entire year, and we were hoping that would be enough. And it wasn't, because the reality of COVID made outbreaks likely. So, and just Executive Council, which is the body that meets in between general conventions, appointed a public health official to advise the creation and modification of this general convention. And the decision was made to shorten it from 8 days of legislative work to 4, which was a huge thing. And just as important is who was going to attend. They were expecting about 10,000 people at the General Convention. And we had to make it so that only bishops, deputies, essential presenters, staff, and event support would be there. So that meant 1,200 people ended up attending. But that meant there was no exhibit hall, which shows the breadth and body of the church. That wasn't there. There was no Episcopal youth presence. There were no visitors. I mean, I was part of the joy and the amazement is simply attending as a visitor and seeing how much there is to the church. And none of that was there. And that was a huge, huge loss. But it kept us as safe as it possibly could. All the deputies and the bishops tested for COVID-19 every morning. We wore masks the entire time. And COVID still spread. I mean, every day, the numbers went up. Now, thankfully, they were much lower than projected, certainly over an 8-day conference, or if there had been 10,000 people instead of 1,200. But it dramatically altered this convention. So much of the work ahead of time was done in legislative work of committees that happened over Zoom. And we made an amazing discovery, and that actually gave it more access rather than less. So much of what was discussed at on the legislative floor was discussed ahead of time. And so that made the work that was accomplished possible.
You know, you're talking about all these wonderful things that go on at General Convention when it isn't 4 days long. Worship, people getting together, even walking on the streets outside of the convention centers. I know I've been fortunate to be 5 conventions, and some of the great conversations that you have, and just walking back and forth from meetings, and that was lost. Was there something lost that you saw? You've been, of course, at various conventions, and I think about the one in Salt Lake City in 2015 when the Salt Palace was full of people. You talk about 10,000, the exhibit hall, people walking across West Temple, down South Temple, up and down the streets to the hotels and the lobbies. Was that lost?
Absolutely. I mean, there was the breadth of the church that is on display at General Convention was not seen, and that was a real loss. I mean, part of convention is that while the House of Bishops meets separately from the House of Deputies, equal clergy and lay, we always come together for worship, along with all our visitors and all the presenters, into this huge space where we always worship together, because that common worship is so critical to who we are as Episcopalians. But that wasn't safe. And so we had our worship within the house. The sermons were pre-recorded, done expertly well, mind you. The 4 reflectors did an amazing job with that format, but it was still different. It was still a different experience, and that's loss. There's no 2 ways about it. That was loss. The city is on display, and Baltimore had been so patient to wait a year for us because it had to be delayed, and it was a much smaller event. And while we learned that we can accomplish a lot over a short period of time, and that we can do a lot of work in advance through the technology of Zoom, it was different. And it was different in a way that had real tangible loss.
So we see that the church is more than administration and even resolutions, and we're going to get into some of those here, but that you see the church as the personal connection, I guess, that was lost. That's an interesting point, because there are those that came back and they said, look, we could do this in 4 days from now on. This could be our new model. I gather you're not endorsing that model.
I think there's a hybrid to go on. I think that having things online and a lot of the work done ahead of time is a good thing. I think that we can shorten the overall time working on legislation. But I do think that there are the need to fully gather as the church. And we need that opportunity, because for so many people, this is the entry point into, wow, this is the church, and not just our home congregation, which we see a relatively limited view, or even our diocese, which is great and gives us a bigger view of the church, but it's still limited. So I do think that we can make some intentional changes, but I don't think that we want to completely go away from everything we've done in the past. I think it's a hybrid of things.
I see. Now let's talk about some of these things that were done thousands of miles away and how they affect your congregation and all the other congregations in our diocese, as well as every place else. One is, as we talked at the top of the program here, the Book of Common Prayer. For somebody like me, who this is my 70th year as a Episcopalian, the Book of Common Prayer, there was the Bible, there was the Book of Common Prayer, and nothing else. I mean, sure, there's trials or here and there, and some modifications. Book of Common Prayer has only been modified in recent times, in the 20s and then in the late 70s. And here we are talking about an entirely different approach. Boy, do you want to explain that? That seems like almost earth-shattering, isn't it?
Sure. Well, earth-shattering is a good way to explain the way Episcopalians approach a new Book of Common Prayer.
Yeah.
Until 1928, it was always assumed that the prayer book that was put forth was going to be the prayer book for all time. Yeah, this is it. We got it right this time. And it was only in 1928 where we made the statement that the prayer book for today isn't the prayer book of tomorrow. And so revision started on day one from the 1928 prayer book being ratified. And the work began on supplemental texts and to, again, help to transition into the inevitable change that was going to happen. Now, that did not make the 1979 prayer book any easier for those who felt devoted and that the 28 book was perfect. But I do think it laid out a process for transformation and change that is always going to be necessary in the Episcopal Church. But now we find ourselves at a different place. We have the entire Book of Common Prayer and all of the supplemental texts that we use in our church already available online. They're downloadable in a moment. And so we already have a church that is using a lot of different liturgical material to express the breadth of the church. And the question that we're wrestling with is, do we make every Episcopal church in the world throw out essentially the 1979 prayer book and accept and only accept whatever next book we publish and require everybody to buy it, considerable expense, and also understand that it becomes obsolete the moment it's printed, because remember, it comes out and that has a trial use for 3 years. So they'll approve it after 3 years, but it's already 3 years out of date. So how do we manage this? What's the best use of resources, but also to acknowledge the breadth of who we are? So what was done at General Convention is we've understood that the prayer book is that breadth, that time-tested breadth of materials that has a process to be made official, and that's over considerable time and approval by the General Convention. But rather than said, we have to print a new book every time we want to change the Book of Common Prayer, we will use the technology that we have to address this. So I've got the resolution in front of me. I'm going to read this first section because this is so critical. The Book of Common Prayer is understood to be those liturgical forms and other texts authorized by the General Convention. So let's take something that was approved back at our 2015 General Convention in Salt Lake City, marriage equality.
Absolutely, yeah.
And we created rights for same-sex marriage. That is not in the Book of Common Prayer, because the past says the only way it can be in the Book of Common Prayer is if we print and ratify a new book and then require everyone to get it. So these marriage rights that have been approved by the church over the same process, that trial use and then ratification for full use, would then be considered an equal standing part of the Book of Common Prayer. All of the Eucharistic prayers that are in Enriching Our Worship 1, which in many cases is the primary Eucharistic prayer that's used in many Episcopal churches, rather than require it to be printed in a single Book of Common Prayer, would now be on equal status as part of the Book of Common Prayer. We have the same restrictions on they have to be approved first for trial use over a 3-year period, and then potentially ratified to be part of the Book of Common Prayer or continued use as a supplemental book. But it doesn't tie our hands to the printing of a singular book. And I think that this is going to be really helpful for the church, because there are some people where the 1979 prayer book is what takes their breath away. It's what says, this is Episcopal liturgy. And we don't need to replace that. But we do need to add things to it, especially in terms of inclusive language and also experiences in racial equity. And all of this needs to have equal weight. And unfortunately, too often, some people say, well, that's not in the Book of Common Prayer. It doesn't really count. It's less than. And when you tell people that their wedding ceremony is less than because it's not in the official 1979 Book of Common Prayer, you have separate but equal. And it's not really equal.
Right.
So I think this gets to the heart of expansive liturgy that still is approved official by our body. And that's a good thing. So I'm very hopeful that this is a constitutional change. So what we did here in Baltimore has to again be addressed in Louisville at the 81st General Convention.
And it has to be pretty much the exact same language. But,
absolutely.
And I'm sure there will be some debate, but as, again, an observer and a practicing Episcopalian, that did seem to me to be very important, and particularly as the church did wrestle, and in some cases it did wrestle with the idea of same-sex marriage, and it was a lot, even people saying, well, this is not possible because it isn't in the BCP, and so it would be almost an offense to do that. So I think it certainly has, and you've expressed that pretty eloquently.
And I want to just add that all of our approved authorized texts in another resolution can now be found at a official liturgical website of the Episcopal Church, which is Episcopal Common Prayer, all one word, .org. And this was created by the Task Force on Liturgical and Prayer Book Revision. So you can see the breadth of what is already happening in the Episcopal Church by going to a single website, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. That access is part of what we value as Episcopalians. It's not just the bishops who have it. It's not just the clergy who have it. It's available to the entire church.
This appears to be a really not just inclusive resolution, but it's a statement of who we are in many ways, isn't it? That it shows that we can evolve, we can change. We do it with a great deal of thought, a great deal of prayer, and 2 different general conventions to pass it. But we can move. And we would talk about the hymnal, but that's a whole other subject, isn't it? So
thank goodness it's another subject that wasn't on our agenda at the moment.
That would take a 7-day session right there. All right, I want to move on, and that is another thing that I think is really appropriate to Utah, and particularly the work of the Reverend Michael Carney in White Rocks at our St. Elizabeth's Church, and certainly the great work of Forrest Kutch, who is one of the parishioners of that church. And that is a recognition, and a long overdue recognition of some of the situations that I'm sure we've seen in the news about what we call the Indian schools, and about indigenous people in general, and a lot of the rights. And again, we just had another Supreme Court decision that perhaps causes some discomfort among some of our friends, brothers, relatives in the reservations. And I know the indigenous resolutions and others that we've talked to have described it as one of the most amazing moments that they felt on the floor of the House of Deputies when these discussions came up. And one of the deputies, Rhonda Uber of our diocese, who was there, described it similar to when the right of the wrong of Cuba in the last General Convention came forward, that this had that same cheerful, but yet, of course, it's recognition of some horrible things that have gone on. Well, with all that long introduction, I'm going to ask you now to pick up that story and to explain what happened, how you felt as a priest in this diocese where you've been aware of the good work on several of our churches, and you've been aware of the issues and just sort of your impressions and what it means for us in Utah, particularly.
Sure, sure. So, yeah, I think I want to begin with the reality that the Episcopal Church is committed to reckoning with the history of racism. And the way you do that is study and share history that's known and history that needs to be uncovered, to have truth-telling about it, a commitment to transform shared leadership, because it's not just making statements, it's about transforming your leadership and to making change. So the particular resolution that Rhonda was referring to was A127, and it was a promise to confront the Episcopal Church's historical ties to the federal system of indigenous boarding schools. And I want to read this section because it's really worth hearing. The 80th General Convention appropriated $2.5 million over the next 2 years, or some other degree of funding commemorate with the Episcopal Church's commitment to the work of truth-telling and reconciliation around its role in indigenous residential boarding schools, to adequately fund the provisions of the resolution, specifically, 1, to fund the creation and support of a fact-finding commission, 2, to fund the work of the Office of Indigenous Ministries to create education resource regarding the church's role in indigenous residential boarding schools, and 3, to fund a grant program to support the work of the Diocese of the Episcopal Church in both conducting their own resource into the diocesan role in indigenous residential boarding schools. That's critical for us here in Utah. And preserving their stories of boarding school survivors and their families. And 4, to support the establishment of community-based spiritual healing centers in indigenous communities across the Episcopal Church to address the intergenerational trauma rooted in the church's role in indigenous residential boarding schools. So that is the requirements that are there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you might not be surprised that no one rose to speak against this resolution. So what usually happens is that if that's the case, that everyone is for something, then you limit the number of people who speak so that we can get on to the vote because we have a lot of business. But that's not what President Jennings did, because we continued the process of telling these stories by giving the time for people to share the stories of their parents, and in some cases their children, and with loved ones, and the experience of the pain and suffering that has been done in the name of the church and the country. And so this time was spent because it was necessary to tell these stories in the midst of our General Convention body. And so it was incredibly moving to hear these individual moments of uncovering the truth. And this is the beginning of the process, but doing it in such a public setting hopefully will show a commitment to doing this throughout the Episcopal Church. So here in Utah, it can be seen as a model for setting up the ability to tell the stories, to change the leadership, and to see where do we go from here. And I think that the resolution spoke to all three of these and put an incredible financial commitment to the process.
It's a very difficult subject to talk about, and I do recommend, by the way, if anyone has the opportunity to go to Phoenix, there's a very moving museum of the indigenous schools, and to go there, it changes it's a life-changing experience to go to. Let me ask you, you're rector of a congregation in Salt Lake City. You are not one that's right next to a reservation. We're of a church that did not operate a school, an Indian school, although I guess we certainly can say we were complacent at that time. There was a school operated in White Rocks, which was not done by our particular faith tradition, but those that went to that school were required to go to the Episcopal Church because it was the closest church to that school, in an effort to try to change, and change is the right word, a group and a culture. Now, let me go back here. You're a rector. What do you think you can do? And that's advice to other priests in charge in our diocese, in places where it wasn't right in our neighborhood. The closest Indian school would have been Brigham City to us. What can you do in your church that goes along with this resolution's concepts? What do you plan to do? And I know you've been very, very supportive of this type of a resolution, and have been a leader and a very good friend and pastoral friend of the efforts in Utah. What do you plan to do, and what can we do as Episcopalians to do something? I mean, I feel almost at a loss. What can I do with 150 years experience, or something to do?
Yeah, well, the first thing to do has already been done, and that was Forrest Kutch and Michael Carney asked people to consider and recognize the original owners of the land that we operate on. So if you ever get an email from me, you'll see, the Reverend Kurt Wiesner, rector, St. Paul's Episcopal Salt Lake City, and then you'll see St. Paul's Episcopal Church occupies and operates upon the ancestral and traditional lands of the Northwestern Shoshone, Gusute, and Ute tribes. And if I made a mispronunciation, I apologize for that. I'm always challenged in that area. But this is a small acknowledgement that can grow into something more. And I think that we need to trust our siblings who are indigenous persons to, again, push us to the growing edge as to what else we can do. I don't have those answers, other than the fact that I know that there are people in the church who have those stories that need to be told. So whether it's creating the forums for them to be told, to intentionally doing it as a diocese, as to be part of these conversations beyond the state of Utah, all of those are necessary in our going forward. I am going to keep a close eye on the task force that's put together and to see what they suggest, because they're the experts in some ways that we can respond appropriately. So rather than assume that I have the answer to that as a white man, I want to give voice to those who have the experience, and also said, this is what we need to do. And if I can be part of those conversations, and great, but I'm not going to steer that ship, because I shouldn't. It's not for me to steer, but it is critical for me and for others already in the place of leadership to raise up new leaders and empower their voices to be heard. And I think you can see some of that in the Episcopal Church as a whole with our elections to our leaders, which we can get into in a little bit.
Sure, and you've been uniquely placed as an observer of this process because of your work that you've done with the Executive Council as a chaplain, and observing, and I know there has been a lot of effort in the Executive Council to try to do this, but you hit it on the head there, that so many of people of this church are not personally have been affected as white people, as we're predominantly in that category. And it is a responsibility we must do. And you've placed it that this is important.
We're paralyzed by guilt a lot of the time, but that paralyzation also keeps us from going forward. Or we shrug our hands up and say, well, there's nothing really to do. Or even the other response, which I hear sometimes, is, well, I didn't do this. And now we're deflecting any responsibility in the learning of history, the truth telling, the change in leadership, and then where do we go from here?
Do you think just as also a interesting personal experience would be to invite your congregation and all Episcopalians, which of course the word invitation is always out, our churches, but to go attend a church in White Rocks or in Randalet are two of our places, that just the sheer going to those communities and attending worship at one of those churches would be helpful for somebody like me who is isolated from much of that experience.
Well, I begin with saying that every time you leave your home neighborhood and go out in the world, that spending a little bit of time in your local Episcopal church or in learning the history of the place that you're visiting is a way to advance your understanding of truth and what's going on and the breadth of who we are. So, going to White Rocks, I would probably talk with the congregation there first, as saying, "Hey, what would be helpful?" Or that sort of or where does this forum happen? Where should this take place? Certainly, I think it's a good idea always to find out again that history of the place. So I would say it's less effective than to say, hey, we're gonna we want one person to come to our space and do a program for us. I don't think that's quite as effective. But I would also say that when you mentioned Executive Council, and Executive Council intentionally at every meeting heard from a group of people who have been marginalized by the Episcopal Church as a whole. We heard our trans siblings. We've heard from the quote Asian American experience, which is so vast, and that's such a that doesn't even begin to encompass this huge breadth of many different cultures that's involved in that statement. And then when we were here in Utah, from Forrest and Michael telling about some of the history of indigenous persons here in Utah and in the surrounding region, and what they experienced sometimes directly from the Episcopal Church. So all of this is part of the solution. It's not simply a doing one thing and being done.
Well, it's been fascinating, and regretfully, we're kind of out of time, and we got so much more to cover. We're going to have to do this again, aren't we? And it's been so, I think, enlightening to hear your experiences. We talk about first-person stories in all of these. That to hear it and to hear it from somebody there. Always before we leave here, Brianna's been recording this all and listening to us, and I want to give her a chance to just ask if she has any observations or questions, and then we're going to let you go. But I have deeply appreciated your time here. It's I think a lot of soul searching, a lot of reflection, and a lot of information that shows just how deep this is. And in a half hour, we can only scratch the surface. Just look what we got to do over the next years and the next time period. But Brianna, do you have any observations, questions?
Yeah, I want to say thank you too. This really has been great, especially as someone that got to observe General Convention remotely. It's good to get a personal story of someone that attended. For some of our listeners, because there was a 4-year gap, this might be their first experience with General Convention, even if they didn't go, just hearing about it, on their own. So I want to ask, just to personalize it even a little bit more, what was your favorite moment from General Convention this year? I know it was different, and hopefully the next one will have a little bit more of that socialization and connection. But for this year, what was a moment that really stood out for you?
So I think watching the final presiding of the Reverend Gay Jennings, President of the House of Deputies, and seeing the 11 years she spent as the President of the House of Deputies, and 20 years before that, deeply involved in the working of the House of Deputies. And the way she functions is that sometimes she is teaching and educating as how the House of Deputies works, because some people are there for the first time ever, and it can be incredibly overwhelming. And there's sometimes, this sort of gentle teaching moment that's there. Other times there's a let's move us along, or let's make this change so that we can allow the voices that need to be heard. But something that Gay has been doing for the past 11 years is raising up new leadership, and leadership of the next generation, and also leadership that moves beyond our dominant white male history. And so perhaps nothing is more obvious of this conclusion than the election of Julia Harris as the new president of the House of Deputies. She's the youngest person ever elected to lead the House. She is the first Latina ever to be the president of the House of Deputies. And it all started for her with a phone call from Gay Jennings, and saying that, and Julia mentioned how shocked she was to see Gay Jennings' name pop up on her cell phone. She had no idea that Gay Jennings even knew who she was. And Gay was there to saying, I need you to be part of this next stage of work. And this is 11 years ago. Because I know you're interested in it, you're a part of this, and we need your voice. And that intentionality of leadership transformation is by far the most important aspect of our General Convention, because if your leaders don't change, it's really hard for the rest of the church to change. Now, we're not done simply because we've elected this awesome young Latina woman to lead our church, but it's a step in the right direction. And if you go and listen to Julia's video address on that 4th day of convention, you're going to get blown away. You're going to get blown away by that transformation.
Yes, I certainly was. So we will link that as well because it was a fantastic moment to bear witness to. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I also want to say that those who went to General Convention as deputies, along with our Bishop-elect Phyllis, are going to gather together to reflect and consider how we as the Diocese of Utah need to engage the work from the 80th General Convention. So all of this is at the very beginning. So as much as I've done reflecting here today, it's only one person's view and start of what needs to happen over the next 2 years before we gather again in Louisville for the 81st General Convention.
And even then, it's going to be amazing because at that point, we elect a new presiding bishop after having it's hard to believe all those years have passed, but we've had, and certainly just as the Reverend Gay Jennings served, and we move on, we keep evolving, but a lot to be done over this next couple of years. So we're going to have to let you get to work because you got a lot to do over the 2 years. But we're going to check back with you because I think General Convention we often think of as it's over now, and now we don't have to do anything for 3 more years. In this case, 2 more years. But that's not true. We're just beginning. So we're going to check back with you. And
I gave myself a few days to allow myself just to go then and pay attention to my 7-year-old. But now it's time to get back into this. It's time we can't lose the breadth of what happened in Baltimore.
Well, with all that, we say thank you very much to the Reverend Kurt Wiesner of St. Paul's here in Salt Lake City, and do take a trip over on to 9th East and take a look at this. This is really a beautiful church, and I think a place of worship, as we say, is the basis of our church. And we thank you for listening to the Utah Epodcopalians. This is a podcast from the Diocese of Utah, where we look at our unusual church in our unusual state and diocese. I'm Craig Worth of the Diocese. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll have another subject coming up.